Hello, welcome to Dominion. I'm Ian. Today we're talking about Richard MacKinnon's Cockfighting in Cape Breton. This is a good article because it talks about those things that typically don't get talked about too much, namely illegal activities. Maybe we should call them non-legal activities. There's a long history. First, I guess we need to describe or define what we mean by this. In that there are, systems of laws are in place and they prescribe what can and cannot be done. And sometimes communities agree with those laws and sometimes they don't. So Atlantic Canada, Cape Breton is a specific example, but throughout Atlantic Canada, there's been, for example, a long history of bootlegging because they were dry provinces for a couple of years. And then the bootlegger, the moonshiner, not only becomes a feature of the community because drink was not necessarily understood as a social ill, despite the fact that there was a vocal enough community that was able to legislate that it was indeed a social ill and needed to be regulated by the state. So you'd have the moonshiner, who was fundamentally entered into the level of folk hero. And there are Newfoundland songs, there are Cape Breton songs that actually sort of celebrate the role of the moonshiner and moonshine in general in Cape Breton. And so it's a non-legal activity. We're not calling them illegal, sort of enters into the same sort of value judgment that introduced them as legal or illegal activities to begin with. So, but that being said, the recognition that these are indeed not allowed by the state and that some kind of specific harm to the person, to the reputation, to the income could befall, they don't become part of the public tradition. And they become something that is much more held in check. Every now and then, of course, a still blows up and the police have to do something, and so they do. You even have the idea that the police are more or less, or the courts are more or less okay with the ongoing existence of it. The more the breach than the observance, as Hamlet says, in terms of the law. But every now and then they have to uphold, so they do. And cockfighting is one of those examples. Now, for me, just in case if this needs clarification, for me, cockfighting isn't one of those things where its illegality is sort of like, oh, well, I guess it's okay. It's gross. It is. I don't mind stating cases. I do not think it should be allowed. I do not think it should be have a blind eye turn to it. I do not think that it is acceptable. I'm not a huge fan of violence as entertainment, or violence as non-entertainment for that matter, but certainly violence as entertainment to begin with. I like John Wick and Kung Fu movies more or less because I enjoy choreography. Not a huge fan of slasher flicks. Hate hockey, hate boxing, hate MME, hate wrestling, all those sorts of things. And doubly so when it's being entered into by animals who have no clear choice in the matter. So, that being said, that sort of apologia, it is a good thing to consider, his article, and it is a good thing to consider the role of cockfighting generally. It's not a Cape Breton specific thing. He clearly lays out the history that this is one of those things that basically, as long as there's the domestication of fowl, there has been the observance that two male chickens of whatever kind of breed are territorial and will fight each other. And then some across the universe, across the world, people in what we might call polygenesis noticed, hey, we can get these people to fight for our entertainment. And by people, I mean roosters. So it's broadly attested to in Indonesia, in South America, in North America, in Europe, as I said, basically everywhere. And I presume that the places where it isn't broadly attested, it probably existed in one form or another and has been quelled, or either the kind of sport as entertainment, or betting, or so on, has curbed, or prescriptions against betting has curbed it. But it happened in Cape Breton, and he goes through a lot of the literature, the newspapers, and demonstrates how it was, of course, it was a legal activity for a long time. It was promoted in the newspapers, and it was promoted in magazines, and just part of the local landscape. And then eventually, for, again, what I consider valid reasons, it was pushed into the underground. But it thrived. He was doing this field work. If you read his footnotes, the field work for this was done in the mid-1970s, so it was still very much a living tradition up till, maybe depending on on who is watching this, but at the very least, the modern age. He was doing these interviews the same year that Saturday Night Live went on the air, so at least put it into that context of modernity, even if I'm an old person. At least it's within my lifetime. So I'm not going to dwell much on the highs, the whys, and the wherefores, and the hows of cockfighting, because it's academically interesting and personally upsetting. I hope if you read this, when you read this, it doesn't throw you off too much. He doesn't go into too much graphic detail, but the very idea is kind of distasteful. But he goes back to the question of why, and people have been theorizing cockfighting for years. One of the classic anthropological articles is Clifford Geertz's Deep Play, Notes on the Balinese Cockfight. And he basically introduced, he wasn't the first person to come up with the term of deep play. I think that was Bentham. But he certainly is the most known proponent of it. And anyway, his idea of deep play is sport or a game, play. I mean, let's first quickly define play. Play is something that one doesn't need to do, but one chooses to do. It is expressly different from work. It is expressly different from the output of labor that is required for meeting the, let's just say, the vital values, the requirements of existence, toil, and so on. Play is expressly and intentionally superfluous. It is unnecessary. Play has rules that are different from the rules of work. The rules of work are there in order to maintain safety, or maintain property, or maintain control over the worker. The rules of play are whimsical. I mean, all a game is a set of rules that we have momentarily decided are critically important for the length of the game. When you are playing soccer, there's no rational reason for me desperately trying to take this thing and move it across this large expanse of grass and get it between these two posts with the help of my friends. Meanwhile, the help of your friends, you are trying to prevent me from doing that, and what is more, trying to get it into the end of my field. Plus, for funsies, no one can use their hands. Nothing is served by getting it to the end, save for the fact that it accomplishes the requirements of the game itself. So, but the question of why we play and why we engage in play, whether as participant or as spectator, is an interesting anthropological question. And Geertz was particularly interested in the cockfight, because it's not simply the playing, it's the gambling that's associated with it. So the thing about the deep play and the Balinese cockfight, and the thing about, because betting on these games is both as the direct bets of the various owners of the roosters, betting against each other, and then all the side bets that would take place, and that's where the sheer economy of cockfighting takes place, is through gambling. On the other hand, it's kind of a game of chance, because a rout might happen, but much of the game is that the cocks are evenly matched at the beginning. And so the expectation is that either one could win. Therefore, the closer you have to it being a toss-up, the more status is accorded by actually wagering real-world things. Actual money that you toiled for, money that might represent not simply your ability to sustain yourself, but ability to sustain your family, and ability to sustain your family not simply now, but for the long run. So there is status accorded the act of gambling itself, and the act of betting. PSA, it's foolish, but it happens, and I think you probably recognize that. You might see it in your own life, that, wow, what a big wager. So there is a inherently, there is the status that is accorded people who take large risks simply for the sake of taking large risks. It's the same reason why actually getting in fights is sometimes a sign of status, not simply in terms of being able to attack someone and the violence that's associated with that, but the willingness to expose oneself to violence is a status act. But also, the status accorded with wagering. And so language that is missing from Richard's chapter here is this issue of masculinities. He frames it in terms of working class culture, because he's asking basically what is at stake. If we want to think, okay, well, it's not simply release, it's of all the possible releases, why this? Why persist in this violent? Why persist in this illegal activity? What is it actually doing for the participants? And by participants, I'm not talking about the cocks themselves. I'm talking about the people who are exposing themselves to risk. It is a criminal act to even be watching a game. So certainly to maintain a pit or to maintain a flock of roosters, they're all illegal under the criminal code. So what is being accorded? And he puts it in terms of the alienation from labor that happens in working class communities. That the lack of control that is sometimes felt, the lack of control over one's body because one has leased it, as it were, to the mine operations, and doubly so when there's strife between worker and management, is one of those things. That's fundamentally the life is a life of frustration, and there is an emotional release, an exhilaration that happens through cockfighting. There is an argument to be made there that is the appeal of, that's fundamentally the history of sports. The history of sports, which game obviously emerged, but the fetishization of sports and then the professionalization of sports didn't really happen until the late 19th century. And a lot of that had to do with working class people who didn't have control over their own constituencies, didn't have control over their own bodies, the output of their labor, their strengths and so on. It was for purposes of someone else. Unlike more traditional labor practices, where it's a one-to-one correlation between, I reap the benefits of the field, or I reap the benefits of hauling the catch. When you start talking about industrial labor like mines or factory work, particularly in more urban settings than Cape Breton, or more urban industrial settings than Cape Breton, but like the steel plant, you are basically, you are not producing, you are expending energy. You might have a set of skills, of course. It's not unskilled labor, but you are leasing those out, and you are not then sort of turning around and selling the product. The people in the steel mill aren't turning around and selling steel ingots. The plant is selling those ingots, unlike the farmer, who at least is selling their products to perhaps an intermediary agent. But I made this thing. So sports is a recognition that one has leased one's body, and there are certain patterns of masculinity that are also in place, in that I mean, Richard talks about masculinities, but he isn't necessarily using the language of masculinities the way the contemporary masculinity theorists are, in that it is a way of reaffirming traditional gender roles that are encoded with things like violence and are encoded with things like the individual. So, the projection of oneself onto the rooster, the cock. Who are we kidding? There's a direct Freudianism there that we've been, as I'm filming this, I've been sort of dancing around the use of the cock in terms of who are we kidding? Let's talk about sort of the phallocentrism and then just move forward. So the rooster, the cock, as a representative of the male who lives or dies by virtue of their own embodied masculine power. Whether they die, even if they die, they died in struggle. They died as the individual. And there is something both, there is something pathetic, but in the true sense of the word there. There's something that fundamentally one feels pathos for. So sympathetic, pathetic in terms of it being sympathetic, pathetic in terms of one feeling towards empathy. In that there is a sense that it's indicative of something. It's indicative of something that within the regular course of day-to-day events isn't being fulfilled and therefore is being fulfilled through this symbolic play. And maybe that's why it is more persistent in industrial, hard-working communities in Cape Breton, and it has disdain thrown upon it by communities in central Canada. You know, they still exist, obviously, but I'm talking about sort of central Canada or the centralized communities with greater economic power, potentially a greater sense of stability, felt by the individual. So, and with different outputs or different outlets for that frustration. It's not that they are more grounded, it's that they have greater opportunities for finding that ground. But those are the communities that then turn around, those central communities are the ones that turn around and then heap disdain on these practices. So again, while I do not want in any kind of subtext to think that cockfighting is something that should be brought back or that should be celebrated, it should be thought of at least through a lens that is ultimately more empathetic than it is disdainful. It's a great article. And again, it talks about one of those things that we don't get to see talked about because we know that this is an activity that will potentially have scorn thrown upon it. Yeah, that's about all I have to say today. So, once more, I've been in beautiful sunsetty Dominion, and I've been talking about Richard MacKinnon's Cockfighting in Cape Breton. As ever, my friends, be well.